All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Hello to all of you. How many participants do we have at this point, Maddie?
We got 14 counting, so 13.
Excellent. Okay, so I can't see many of your faces, but that's okay. All right, I wish I could. So today my talk is about conducting research with human subjects in global contexts, attaining IRB approval. And so we can go on to the next slide. Maddie is going to navigate my slides. We're trying to do a little experiment here to see if this works better. But what I wanted to talk about today is how we can advance science or social science inquiry while simultaneously protecting human subjects. Feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me whenever you want. If you're passionate about something and I'm going too fast, absolutely interrupt me. I do have several slides where we're going to go into some breakout rooms for critical thinking and to talk about your own specific research questions. But I will just move right along as we go otherwise. So pause to consider from your perspective and your experience doing research or your intentions for doing research in global contexts with human subjects. What are some factors, some important factors in protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects while conducting research across the globe? What are some different mechanisms or factors that we have to consider no matter what the type of research we do? David, I'm going to pick on you because I see you right there. Any factors? What's involved? Oh, you're on mute, David. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think we have to consider if we are going to have direct contact with human subjects.
Absolutely. Are we going to have person-to-person contact with human subjects? So right there, you talked about you, the researcher. And when you said we, what do you mean by we? Who is we?
That depends. I mean, if you have somebody working for you at the other site or the other country, you have to know if that person will have direct contact with the participants too or not.
Exactly, exactly. So you mentioned participants, you mentioned direct contact, you mentioned somebody else working with you. So we're making reference to an entire research team, right? So you don't go in as a PI and handle everything. We work together, we collaborate as a team, all right? So what do you think is the most important factor when you think about this team? You think about the way we execute research, the way we collect data. Are we canvassing doorsteps? Are we in a laboratory setting? Are we in the community doing outreach? Do we have a scheduled convenient time for everybody to come in and gather? Okay, so in all those scenarios, what do you think is the most important factor? Any ideas? All right, let's go to the next slide and I'll tell you. It is trust, okay? And you, the researcher, okay? So you, the researcher, you're the most important part of that entire equation. Why? Because you have direct contact with the human subjects, and you are going to be the one to promote trust in research with the human subjects, right? The participants need to trust you, the PI of the study. You also collaborate with the researchers, right? As PI or faculty sponsor, you will be collaborating with the researchers. Scientists must be able to trust each other, and each other includes you. The human subjects always have to be able to trust you, the researcher. So how do we do this? How do we establish this web of trust in global context when we are based here in St. Louis? So on to the next slide. Right here, we have Resnick's 2018. Resnick's, it's funny because he published this just as I was going to publish it, so he beat me to it. But here is a whole list of factors involved in this web of trust with research that involves human subjects. And this takes place in all contexts, global, local, national, whatever it be. But look at all those different factors there. We have collaborators, other investigators, part of our research team. We actually have the human subjects themselves. We have these big communities and populations, the general public. We have our sponsors. Let's say we're an NIH grant recipient or NSF or a Department of Defense. Like, what is the sponsor of our research? Is Washington University the sponsor of our research, or do we defer to the funding protocols as the sponsor? We also have these institutional officials who get very involved. So if you look at this web of trust, there's a lot of bidirectionality here, right? You look at all these arrows that go back and forth. There's bidirectionality. What we have to establish though, and what the most important part of these interacting mechanisms is trust, okay? And so let's go on to the next slide. So why CV? Okay, CV is me, right? Cindy Brantmeier. Why am I here talking about this? And I wanted to give you a little bit of background before I delve into all the policies regarding oversight committees and ethics review committees and all this stuff. Main reason is because I do research in global context, right? So on to the next slide. You can see different parts of the world, and the bluest, the two blue regions, the sort of aqua blue and the other blue color, those are the regions where I have actually had IRB approval to conduct experiments, okay? My experiments have been in the confining limits of laboratories. They have been in classroom environments during convenient times of classes, but they've also been in community outreach groups, okay? So on to the next slide. This also shows more of the countries where I have actually conducted research and had IRB approval from oversight ethics review committees to do so. So that's primarily why I'm here talking about this as the Faculty Fellow for International Research in the Vice Chancellor's Office, or the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Research. And that's probably why I was asked to take on this inaugural position. But it's also because I've been audited. 3 or 4 different times. It depends if you call the last one an audit or not. But I've been audited, formally audited, between 3 and 4 times since my 20 years here at Washington University. And the auditing process can be quite daunting, right? The last time I was audited, I was notified it the day before I was supposed to, I was departing to go to China. This was a year and a half ago. That was my last audit. And it can be a grueling process and it can be daunting, but the greatest thing about the audit is you learn throughout the whole process, but you also become great partners with IRB, right? And if you do everything right and you follow the policies, which are usually federally mandated, you're fine, right? Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. And I want to highlight for you today, so this is from the fall of 2019. We don't have an accurate count of this right now because of the impact of COVID on our global research. But as of the fall of 2019, these are the list of the highest 8 numbers of submitted, of global IRB approved research studies. And as you can see, we've got half of the highest number on our Danforth campus, right? We have a lot on, people always think of global research, they think of Institute of Public Health, they think School of Medicine, you know, Division of Oncology, Division of Cardiology, and I work with a lot of those divisions, okay? But we also have a ton of studies here on our Danforth campus that are also submitted to IRB for approval with human subjects in global context. Our biggest number is anthropology, followed by political science and international and area studies. So you can see we do, and then we have social work as well. So we did make the top 4 on the Danforth campus with highest numbers of submission for research in global context that requires approval for work with human subjects. Okay, so on to the next slide. How do we navigate that complex web that I showed you earlier? How do we navigate that while simultaneously adhering to regulations? Well, it's interesting because I'm part of the Danforth IRB advisory board. And at one point, a group of people showed up to our advisory board complaining, and rightfully so, about lots of different things involved with obtaining IRB approval to conduct research in global context. And so I raised my hand at this meeting and I said, you know, I actually have a checklist that I've just developed on my own that I require my PhD students and my advanced undergraduates for honor studies, thesis, and everybody to check off prior to submitting to IRB. And so I started to share that checklist. And then if we go on to the next slide, I ended up inviting a whole group of people from the Danforth campus to help develop an official checklist, an international research checklist for IRB studies at WashU. And I sent this out, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, to all of the IAS faculty and students. But I want to give credit to the really hard workers who were on this committee. Jeff Childs in anthropology, he helped me so much with this checklist. Why? Because the anthropologists do more field work, more, they have field assistants and they do field work, which is very different than the lab, community outreach and stuff that a lot of us do. Fred in social work, Lindsay in social work, Mitch in psychology, Michael in poli-sci. And then we also invited some representatives from HRPO and our very own director of IRB, Martha Jones, who left Washu last year and is now at Harvard. But still, we all got together as a group and we worked for weeks on this checklist, okay? And we updated every 2 months to make sure all the links and everything are accurate. And so I wanted to give credit to this entire team because it was a collaborative effort that I spearheaded, but without their help and their guidance, we would have never made this possible. So on to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about subject or participant. I'm going to use subject throughout this discussion today because that is the federally mandated term we use. However, I am extremely aware of the whole debate that's going on out there about why we are calling our people who participate participants or why they are subject. A subject can be viewed as demeaning. I don't mean disrespect to anybody in any way, shape, or form by using the word subject. It's just the federal talk so much with oversights reviews and ethics reviews. I tend to lean on that. You'll find whenever I'm presenting my own research, I always use the word participant because in my field, we would never say the word subject. So participant really does imply collaborative or active participation. Okay, next slide, please. So prior to creating an IRB application, we created that funky international research checklist. And what I'm going to do today is go through like 5 or 6 parts of that I think really apply to the types of research I'm familiar with in international and area studies. So I always suggest to everyone, before you begin to plan your study, whether it's your advanced undergraduate student planning the study, it's somebody who is taking the IIS 400 or 500 level independent study credits with you, if you're their faculty sponsor, if it's your PhD student, or if it's you as the PI, I strongly recommend that you contact IRB to tell them precisely the focus of your study so that they can follow through with timely interactions and timely feedback. And I'm not sure all of you know this, but just recently on 9/3/2020, I sent this to Director Andy Sobel to send out to everybody in IIS. We recently created a really great Research Protection Office plan where IRB will pair you up immediately with somebody who is familiar with your type of research, okay? So that you don't call in and get somebody who is going to give you all the answers for biomedical research or clinical trials, right? I mean, we need to be partnered with the appropriate person. So we do have a mechanism in place to do that. So I'd strongly suggest that's what you do, okay? So you set up, onto the next slide, you set up your partnership with IRB. The next thing is to identify the international site's local regulatory requirements, okay? You need to reach out to the HRPO partner that you've already established and see whether or not here at WashU, we are aware of our international sites regulatory requirements, okay? And you have to check to see if you need that site letter of approval, okay? This can be from a research ethics committee. For example, in Guatemala, they don't have regional ethics committees. They only have a national regulatory office. And so you have to get a letter from the National Regulatory Office in Guatemala to do any studies. We just got approval for one in oncology. And we had to go through all these loopholes through the National Regulatory Office. But our IRB will direct you to that. They will tell you, you know what, in Nicaragua, por ejemplo, wanted to do research last summer in Nicaragua, they don't really have a National Regulatory Office. You absolutely have to go get approval through the institution where you are conducting your studies. You can also get approval through a local university department chair, or like I said earlier, some institutes have like these internal oversight committees. So that's the first thing you need to do. You need to identify the site's local regulatory requirements. I just helped a group in social work. We're trying to obtain approval in the Republic of Georgia, where I've also done research before. And since I did research 7 years ago, it completely changed. So be aware that as you ask these questions to IRB, they may not have the latest approval, and it may take a few days for them to obtain your international site's regulatory requirements. So rule number one, be patient, okay? Sometimes it can't happen overnight, and as we all know, there's huge time constraints across the globe, so we have to just be patient and wait. So next slide. So if the local IRB or ethical committee review is not required, okay, as the case in Nicaragua, no, or it is not available, you have to identify, this is your job as either the faculty sponsor or the PI, you have to identify a cultural review expert who can provide you with documentation about the cultural appropriateness to your IRB, okay? Keep in mind that the expert you provide to our IRB cannot be a research team member, okay? So, you know, if you have a team set up and you've been working with these people for years, you can ask them, you know, is there someone who has resided in your, and it can't be somebody like me, for example, who just lived in Nicaragua for 1.5 years, no? Or I lived in Mexico for 1 year. That does not make me a cultural expert for Nicaragua ni Mexico, okay? You can't be, you know, a cultural expert is somebody who permanently resides in the country, usually somebody was born there or has been there. They usually like to go back at least 10 years, but this just really depends on the nature of your study. So if you, the whole thing about culture, right? Like, what is culture? Well, of course, the anthropologists are going to say culture is the life of the everyday people, okay? People in my field are going to say, yeah, it's the life of everyday people, but it's also the political figureheads. It's the people, it's the authors who are writing authentic readings for native speakers to native speakers. Like, we all have our own definition of culture, right? It's very discipline specific. So IRB has come up with these 5 questions that we ask, that our IRB asks cultural experts, okay? The first is, how do you have the knowledge of the local research context? Very open-ended question. How do you feel that how could you operationalize yourself as a local research expert? Do you foresee potential risks to individuals? Very open-ended. Could individuals be placed in jeopardy for providing the research or with opinions about this topic? I mean, if you're a woman, if you I mean, there's a lot of issues there with demographics, okay? Are you asking very delicate questions or not? Is the consent process understandable? Do they understand that when they sign that consent form, that human subject consent form, that their name will be erased off that form, but the answers will be used for research purposes? The answers will be used to publish, either an academic journal or a health journal, whatever it is. And does the recruitment process meet the cultural norms of this area? Okay, so I wanted this group because international area studies, I mean, at the end of the day, we're all examining culture in one shape or form, right? So what I wanted to do right now is have you each, I wanted to, Maddie wanted to have, you know, she's gonna form the breakouts, and I want you to discuss specific examples of these 5 I have listed on this screen. So I'll give you like 6 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back to where we were. So if you can all, you should be getting your question, or you should be getting an invitation to break out. If it doesn't work, Maddie, we can do this collectively.
How many groups would you like? We have 12 participants.
I would say groups of 3. So 4 groups.
The toolbar keeps disappearing on me.
Yeah, Zoom has been a mess today.
So 2 or 3?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Well, I'm trying.
If it doesn't work, we can do it collectively. We've, Washu in general has experienced a lot of issues with Zoom today. I know in this,
Yeah.
right? All right, maybe just for time, we could do it collectively. So it's okay, Maddie, we're good. I mean, we're only 12 people anyway. It's not like this is 50 where we have to all fight over each other to talk. So could somebody give me some examples of how somebody would identify themselves as having the knowledge of the local research context? Or some potential risks to individuals? See, I knew if I did this together, nobody would talk.
Okay, I can try to answer the first question.
Okay, NGA.
So for an example, could be a professor who works at an institution. I think she could be she could be kind of a local research context since she knows how kind of the culture of the not only the country in general, also the local, like the culture of the university, and then how they kind of culture works there.
So Angie, that was an excellent example, and it blends really well with number 4, right? The number 4 is the consent process understandable. So even in China, in NGA's home country, when I have gone to China to conduct experiments, you know, sometimes the Chinese participants who I've invited, they feel that they're obligated. They feel that they cannot say no. Why? Because the professor of their class recruited them. And even though it's not a convenience sample and I'm not doing the experiment during class time and they're not going to get credit for it for class, they still feel like they're obligated. So I, as the PI, I always say, you know, you can opt out at any point in time during the study if you want, okay? This is not a requirement. Fortunately, my experiences in China is everybody still stays in anyway. But it's really, really important to explain that, you know, that the consent process is there for a reason, that to consent to allow the research be used for research purposes. Okay, what about the recruitment process? Does it meet the cultural norm?
She frozen for everyone else. No,
Yeah.
you're back. Okay.
All right, I thought maybe it was just me.
No, you froze for a little bit.
Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next slide then. I think we're unfrozen. All right, so actually the next one, you went back instead of forward. There we go. And then,
Okay.
All right, so, and this is very critical. We need to identify the appropriate regulatory official or individual who can provide you with documentation that local IRB or ethics review is not required, okay? So you need some kind of official documentation to show that a local IRB or ethics review is not required. If that's the case, then you will defer to Washu's IRB, okay? And then Washu's IRB will take over and they will absolutely have requirements for you to fulfill in order to get the approval to conduct the study. And sometimes people on our Danforth campus get a little defensive with this. And I always try to stress to them, yeah, Andy's smiling. I try to stress that IRB, they're our partners. I mean, I am a person who has been funded by all types of different agencies, right? And different funding agencies. And for my own protection, I love to have IRB's approval, right? Because when I am audited, I have crossed all those T's and dotted all those I's and I have everything set to go. I mean, it's for your own protection too, but it's more important than yourself. It's for the protection of the human subjects, the participants you're going to be doing your work with. That's the most important thing, is the participants in the study need protection and deserve protection. So it's always important to document everything. Okay, so move on to the next page. Do your research documents need to be translated? This is a question I got from a number of people in IAS in past years. Absolutely, yes. Okay? You absolutely have to translate your documents. You are in a lucky place at Washu because Washu is one of the few IRBs that allow you as the PI or the faculty sponsor to actually do the translation. Okay? Most IRBs do not allow anybody on the research team to do the translation. You have to actually hire it done outside and it has to be an official translator. Washu's pretty relaxed with that and I haven't really addressed it with them because I think we're just fine the way it goes. But you should always document the names and the qualifications of the translators for data collection instruments, your informed consent and everything else, okay? You just want everything documented. All right, so go on to the next page. Are there country-specific licenses or permits necessary for these procedures to be performed on the international site? Do you need, I mean, there's not too many in the group here I see that do clinical procedures or permits for drugs, devices, but we definitely use technology. A lot of us do technology-driven experiments in other countries, okay? And you have to check to make sure that if there is a country-specific license or permit. Usually your research team will be able to help guide that, but that is a question that IRB will ask you, and you will have to have documentation to prove whether the answer is yes or no, okay? So continue. So do you want to compensate your research participants? Okay, a lot of us get these small mini grants, right? To compensate and pay them, okay? If yes, are there any laws or regulations that prevent you from doing this? Okay, and there are, absolutely. I have come across a lot of country-specific laws where you are not allowed to pay your participants. You cannot give them a Starbucks card worth $20 to be a participant in your experiment. Here in St. Louis, yeah, we can. We do it all the time. You know, we hand out Starbucks cards all the time and bring our students at Washu into our laboratory to do experiments, okay? That is not the case in a lot of countries. So you absolutely have to make sure you are doing what's culturally appropriate to compensate them. A big question we often get is, can you give the students class credit, okay? That's very country specific. You have to look at the local regulatory requirements at the institution, okay? It is pretty common here at Washu to get class credit to be a participant in an experiment, okay? Some institutions across the US do not allow that. All right, so let's go on. Are you going to ask local individuals, non-WashU faculty, staff, or students to assist you with the study? This goes back into what David said earlier about your entire research team, okay? And this involves the procedures, the recruitment, the pilot, the informed consent, whatever part of the process anybody on site is being, is involved in your project. You absolutely have to collect and document their names, qualifications, and protocol training. This is only required when international sites do not have a local IRB. People confuse this a lot. People who, especially in the last like 4 or 5 years, they feel like their research team needs to be taking the training modules set forth by our IRB. And of course, there's a lot of limitations with those. First of all, they're all in English, only English. Okay, so if you're working with a group of people whose English is, who have language issues and their language is limited, we have issues there, right? However, most international sites that do have a local IRB in the native language, okay? So basically you need to be sure to clarify and describe the role and identity as non-WashU research staff. So anybody who is helping from start to finish, whether they're analyzing the data with you, whether they're just getting whether they're staff and they're helping all the participants sign consent forms, they absolutely have to be approved, okay? Either by the local oversight committee or WashU's IRB, all right? And that's where auditors come in and find some pretty huge issues, okay? So come on and let's go to the next slide. Are there any country-specific laws or regulations about data collection or data transportation? Actually happened that I was in China. I was stopped at the airport in Beijing because they wanted to see my thumb drive, my data set on my thumb drive, because I went over on a visiting faculty visa. And I literally just made my airplane to get my connecting flight to get back to California. But you just turn it over. You say, absolutely, here it is. And I was given a specific form from the Ministry of Education on how to carry my data set back to the United States, okay? And it had to be on a thumb drive, okay? And now things have changed. I mean, I think in the last, well, now things are totally different, but going back 8 months ago, you could actually send it over some, online electronic means and all kinds of things. So my point is, these country-specific laws about the data collection and then transporting it back in the US change. You can't lock up collection instruments in a storage cabinet in another country. You usually have to have input it all into a repository, okay, into some kind of repository that we have approved here at WashU. You cannot put it in your luggage and bring it back, okay? You can't put all your written data collection instruments in your luggage, check it into the plane and bring it back to the US. And you also cannot mail it. You can't put it in the mail and send it back, okay? So this is a very serious question. And people don't understand how much time this can take, right? This can take a lot of time. You might have to allocate an additional week in the other country, in Kuala Lumpur, if you're doing research in Malaysia, to actually get all the data input into a database, because you're not going to be able to bring in all this paper data back to the US. Okay, so next slide. Identifiable data. This is a critical issue with a lot of research in global context with human subjects on the Danforth campus. On our consent form, we usually have our participants print their name and also sign their name, right? But the minute they are done with their study, that consent form usually needs to be, the signing process needs to be deleted. It needs to be kept in the storage the way IRB tells you to, but they need to become a number. So once you're transferring the data from the packet to the database online, the repository, whether it's SPSS, RStat, or whatever you're using, right? You now have to change that participant to a number, okay? So you should never be able to go back. Anybody who's working on your team shouldn't be able to go back and identify who did this. Some of you who do mixed methods research are like, what? What if my data is emerging as I collect it? What if I don't write? What if I don't have these research questions that are right or wrong answers, but the data is going to emerge? And then I want to go back and identify a participant and follow up with a semi-structured interview. Okay, this happens all the time. Well, you need to modify and you need to get permission to do that. Okay, there's different ways to do it. It really depends on your study. Okay, so go to the next slide, please. Is your consent process culturally appropriate? We already talked about that. And you can build in a lot of flexibility. The critical thing here is time. Researchers, especially on the Danforth, get really upset with the amount of time it takes, but you've got to remember that IRB is working with you, and they're doing the best they can to make sure that they are doing it all right according to the local policies, and they will give you as much guidance as they can. And it's for, you know, the protection of the participants and you. So just build in a lot of flexibility with that and be prepared. Once you press submit and you submit that IRB protocol, it can take, you know, 2 or 3 weeks, okay? We get researchers all the time who get really upset about it because they're grant funded and they're like, wait a minute, in order for me to accept this grant, I have to have Washu's IRB approval. And we're like, well, we have to go through everything we have to do to get that approval. And so we try to speed it up as fast as we can, but that's just something you have to build in. You have to build in some flexibility and time. Okay, so next. So all research teams, including your faculty sponsor, must have the Washu Human Subjects training in order to be added to the research team, okay? So people forget that. People, especially on the Danforth campus, don't realize that when you're a faculty sponsor for honors theses, or advanced credits, those 300 and 400 independent research credits, and your students are conducting research with human subjects, even if it's online, it's conducted remotely, and they're not even having the interaction, the face-to-face interaction, you still need to go to the training, okay? The IRB city training. Some people call it CITI training, some people call it city training, but we have these training modules. And just received a notification the other day saying mine expired, and it was kind of funny because I was like, it was just funny because I think I last took it 5 years ago, but like I think they must have you redo it every 5 years, okay? So, and it's not hard, you just have to do it. Those of you whose English is your second or third or fourth language, I want you to know it's all written in English, and there's a lot of reading comprehension. I've convinced IRB not to let the screen lapse out anymore after 15 seconds or whatever it was, so that you can take your time and really, really try to listen and understand before you submit your answers to the test, because there's a test at the end. Okay, you have to read and listen, and then you got to take a test. All right, so next. And I'm looking at the time. All right, perfect. So have you thought about your research documentation? Okay, this is critical. And the 3 points to consider are this, and very important that you document what you do, when you do it, and to whom it's done. Okay, I know that seems tedious, but you know, as a forensic linguist, I am so used to substantiating everything I do with facts and documents that for me, it's just the way I do things, but it's really important for all researchers to document what you do, when you do it, and to whom it's done. If you call IRB SWAT number, and a SWAT team member says, hey, this is minimal risk. You don't need to bother with this. It's minimal risk. Take that person's name down, document the day and time, I usually follow up with an email and I'll say, thank you so much for the exciting news that this is minimal risk and it's an expedited review and on subject's approval. Can you please confirm I understood this correctly? And I have them send it back. I print it off and I put it in my file, okay? I mean, you should just always document it, especially if you think you might get audited someday. And people get audited even if they're, by the way, even if you're not funded, your research is not funded, you can still get audited. I got audited on an experiment I did that was not funded. And I was just randomly selected, so they told me anyway. I'm like, okay. But they told me I was randomly selected to be audited. It was actually with a college prep program. And I learned a ton through that audit because I did not know that in the state of Missouri, foster kids' parents, the foster parents are not the legally allowed to sign a consent form. Okay, so for minors who are under 18, you know, all of their parents signed their consent form to participate in the study that I was conducting that summer. But I had 5 participants in that group who were minors, but they were in foster homes and their foster parents signed. Well, I didn't get in trouble for it, but IRB really came down on me and said, Cindy, and I'm like, how would I ever know this? First of all, I'm not from Missouri. It was actually the first time I had ever conducted research with people under the age of 18. But IRB was awesome. Like they showed me all the legal laws for this and I'm like, who knew? At Indiana University in Indiana, that's not the case. Like foster parents absolutely can sign and give consent for the foster child to participate in experiments. But here in the state of Missouri, that is not the case. So I learned that big lesson. But just always remember, when something cannot be done, you also need to document. And just always remember, this makes me sound like I'm a forensic linguist when I say this, right? Well, I am, but if it's not documented, it did not happen. Okay, and that in the eyes of an auditor, in the eyes of IRB, and in the eyes of your local IRB ethics review committees on site in international contacts, if it's not documented, it just never happened. Okay, so just make sure you have written documentation. All right, and by the way, Human Subjects Research website has really awesome forms all over it now and templates that you can use for these documentations. So you just print it off, fill it out, and it's done. Okay, so next slide. I wanted to talk to you about different rights and violations that have been cited that are less dramatic. And I say less dramatic because I'm talking to people on the Danforth campus today, right? I would give a different list if I was giving this talk at the medical school for clinical and non-clinical studies. But this is the list. These are examples from Resnick 2018 that are less dramatic examples of violations with the types of research that all of us do. First of all, enrolling a subject who does not meet the inclusion criteria, right? If they're not in the age range or they didn't self-report gender, but you assign gender, they can't be included. You know what I mean? You have to enroll subjects who absolutely meet the inclusion criteria. And another big thing is using unqualified staff to perform research procedures. By that meaning they didn't do the city training. Failing to adequately protect confidentiality. This is critical. This is critical, especially in global contexts where you're oftentimes bringing data sets back to the United States. Not disclosing important information during the consent process, okay? Let's say you're doing a study in Kuala Lumpur, or I'm not sure where, but you didn't back translate the consent form from English to your target language, right? And you handed the consent form out in English. Well, this is a huge problem, right? Failing to carefully monitor the health of subjects in a clinical study. I included this here because mental health is also a part of a lot of the research we do on our campus. So this has to be carefully monitored and you have to abide by all the regulations for this. Number 6 is a big one. This is a big one that I have seen in like the last 5 years as well on our own campus, is not reporting adverse events in a timely fashion. The last I checked, don't quote me on this, but the last I checked, the PI or the faculty sponsor has exactly 72 hours to report any adverse events in a timely fashion to IRB. Okay, and you shouldn't feel like you're getting the research team in trouble, right? What you're doing is protecting the participants, right? And if there's any questions like that, you can always consult really experienced, seasoned researchers on on the Danforth campus, but you do need to report any adverse events in a timely fashion to whoever authorized the human subjects study. Okay, next. And if you're interested, you can take a great look at the IRB Submission International Checklist. This is the pre-IRB. I strongly encourage this out. Have your students fill this out before you submit anything to IRB. This will make the process, the start and finish time, go way faster if you've completed this checklist that the whole group I put up before earlier has prepared for you. And we update this like every 2 to 3 months, so everything is updated and ready to go. All right, and the next slide, and I think, yes. So this is my very last slide, and it's perfect timing because we have 13 minutes before the hour. So if anybody's interested, you could share your current research agenda in light of the different areas I highlighted about the pre-IRB submission checklist. We could talk about our research questions, how our, and by the way, these are things that IRB looks for. I don't think people are always aware of the fact that IRB does require you to show how this research is contributing in a unique way to the dearth in the database. Okay, so you have to supply IRB with a literature review. You can't just do a study because you're fascinated by this particular phenomena. It has to be grounded. It has to be grounded in theory and research that has been published. You have to show what your unique contribution is, because IRB doesn't want to, you know, and your chairs and your colleagues don't want their time to be wasted if this has been done a million times. We already know the answers to all this. What are you doing this for? So IRB will look for, there's 2 different questions on the IRB protocol that you submit that ask you to prove that this is a significant contribution to the database in your field. Instruments you're going to use to collect. When I use the word instruments, people think I'm poking and prodding or doing a spit test, which I've done before with the anxiety work on language acquisition. Not poking and prodding, but spit test to look at anxiety. But the instruments also mean paper instruments, okay? It means the computer, okay? The computer screen is an instrument. Whatever you are using to collect data, if it's a tape recorder, audio recorder, cassette, okay, now I'm dating myself, right? Like I'm telling you my age. When I said cassette recorder, really? But you know, whatever you're using to collect data, these instruments have to be grounded in prior research and have to be validated. And where are you going to conduct a study? All this stuff has to be answered. IRB always wants to know the number of participants, and this can get very frustrating for people on the Danforth campus, because you're like, what if I get there and I thought I only have approval to do this with 200, but guess what? 600 showed up. Always err on the side of caution and get approval for the max you think would ever come to your study, all right? Because it's really hard to go back and modify that number after you've put that on there. Are you going to have a control group and an experimental group? Are you doing associations or relationships? Are you trying to make predictions? Are you doing a regression model? Or are you looking at all these interacting independent factors and you want to look at outcomes and predict their success on a particular, you know, speaking test or oral production test? If you're looking at the role of working memory and how that impacts your ability to listen when somebody's interrupting you. I'm bringing all examples from my own research, right? But do you have this control group and an experimental group? Do you have a group where that's not going to be interrupted at all, that gets to think freely? And isn't it, you know, I mean, you have to think about these things in the way you're going to convince IRB to sign off on your study. And then, of course, you should always talk about who's going to be on your research team, and all of that should be handled. By the way, you can add people on your research team as time goes on. Like if you get there and you start meeting more people, and you realize that they want to become a part of your research team, IRB at WashU is really flexible. A lot of institutions are not flexible at that. The team has to be set, but WashU is. You can email your IRB partner and say, hey, so-and-so and so-and-so really wants to help with this. She needs this for promotion, or she needs this for the experience. I would love to add her to the team. And they'll tell you exactly what guidelines to follow to do that. So, on that note, does anybody, I feel like this was way teacher fronted here, sorry about that, but is there any, does anybody have any questions or feedback? Any specifics you'd like addressed about anything?
I would love to ask you a quick question.
Sure.
I don't know how this gets handled at WashU, but what about, does IRB, if someone's working with social media accounts, not not just, like using data that is publicly available with social media. I know that was a debatable thing a couple of years ago, so I'm just wondering what the status is today, if you know.
To my knowledge, the last conversation I was involved with that in IRB was that, yes, you do need IRB approval, or you need it documented that they told you you don't need it. Okay, so no matter
Right.
what, you should contact them. But yeah, they were going to develop a process for examining data that's distributed on social platforms. Okay. And so, yes, Amy, yeah, there is a protocol that IRB has set forth. It's not very complicated, primarily because you can't control what people are going to put up, right? You are observing,
Right.
You're not doing it you're not asking specific questions. You're looking at what they're posting on social media. But so IRB does have a protocol for you to follow for that, and then just document it for the protection of the participants and your own protection.
Yeah. I haven't started the study yet, but I'm at the sort of beginnings of it because the original study, unfortunately, the area I study had a number of really bad situations with IRB not being, not being followed properly. And so I'm trying to find ways to get the answers to my questions that are as least invasive as possible.
So Amy, I could actually connect you with the person that kind of oversaw one of the committees that was addressing those issues with social media. I can connect you with that person in IRB, and it would probably make your process a lot easier.
That'd be great.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll email you after this and I'll connect you because it'll save you a lot of time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been so helpful, and I have to step out to go to another thing I'm hosting, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks a lot. Okay, any other specific questions or any comments for feedback? Probably not. And you guys will probably all email me separately, which always happens with these talks. People don't want to ask their questions, and I understand that. When I give talks like this at the medical school, I never get any questions. But then after, my email will be full of questions for weeks after, because people sometimes don't feel comfortable revealing their doubts, or they feel a little anxious talking about it. So if you do have specific questions, please, and always know that I represent the faculty here and the students. My role at IRB is to represent the faculty and the students. So I do my best to help you navigate what IRB expects. But Andy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment. So Cindy covered a lot of ground here, and a lot of it is heavily influenced by clinical work at the med school or in psych, or with more experimental design. So if you're an undergrad, don't be intimidated by this. There's a lot of stuff here that actually isn't going to be that relevant to you. You'll get an expedited process, or they'll push back with some questions that are going to be important for your research or in your context, particularly for the safety of people that you're involving in your research, whether it's an interview or whatever. But all the criteria that Cindy's laying out here, most of you who are doing undergraduate research when you study abroad for IAS or something else, you're not going to have to check off half of this stuff. And so it'll be a lot easier. So don't give up on your research because this looks intimidating.
Yes.
It's actually going to be a lot easier. You'll get frustrated with the timing, but now that they've got this expedited process, it ought to be a lot better. And then the other comment I would make is, IRB isn't so much worried about your safety. They should be, but what they're really interested in is the safety of the participants, right? Whether that's psychological, mental, physical, or whatever. And you should be aware that in some of those situations, you as the researcher might actually be at risk too, right? Because if you're asking people upsetting questions and they get angry, You're the person in the room with them. So IRB isn't necessarily going to look out for your interests in that case, but they are going to look out for the participants. So you need to actually think hard about whether you're putting yourself into a situation that could be problematic also. That would be all I would.
Yeah, Andy, those are excellent points. And to add more details about your first comment, what IRB will look at initially is the risk. Okay, and it sounds like from what Andy just described, a lot of you have minimal risk, you know, in your inquiries, right? There's minimal, and by minimal risk, IRB operationalizes that to mean, you know, is this what a participant would do in their normal lives or not? You know, in their regular daily life. And if the answer is no, they would never have a conversation about this and they would never do it this way, then that's where you will have to, you know, supply a lot of information and go through a lot of loopholes. But in a lot of the IAS projects, like the ones that I saw last year at the honors thesis gathering and stuff, really were minimal risk projects. So right. I think Andy's point is well stated. I actually didn't even give the presentation like I would have normally for most faculty in Danforth. I really tried to focus on, I thought, the pieces that would be most applicable to IAS students, and also bring in some mixed methods questions about data emerging. But Andy's point of the sensitivity of the questions is critical. So that's, and those of you who are advanced undergraduates and PhD students, that is where your faculty sponsor will give you some really good advice. You know, your faculty sponsor, your faculty advisor who signs on to sponsor your project, you know, you're partnering with that faculty member too. And so when in doubt, always ask your faculty sponsor first. And then if the sponsor can't answer your question, then ask, you know, you two together can call IRB. I mean, IRB always gets questions from me and my students together, where we call them together. And I say, I'm on the phone with so-and-so, you know, we're calling together to ask you this. And, but yeah, because there are some delicate, sensitive topics that you need approval to talk about. So.
Yeah, and if you have questions, you should call the IRB people, because don't assume. For example, Cindy was talking about you're not allowed to compensate people, but at least, you know, a lot of the development experiments in the field, actually, they're not compensating, but they're incentivizing people. So the compensation it's not compensation, it's part of the experiment. So if people bring their kids for vaccines. If you give them a bag of beans or you know, a pewter plate or something like that, and they run an experiment, and so you may be viewing that as compensation, but when you build it into the experiment, it's actually part of the design of the research. And so but you wouldn't know that if you don't check with the IRB people as to, you know, if you have a question about that. So as you're thinking about your design, you want to sort through those sorts of issues.
Excellent point, definitely. Well, if anybody has any more questions, any specific questions, feel free to reach out to me. I want to stress again that I'm here to support the faculty and the students. You know, people are always like, whose side are you on, Cindy, IRBs or faculty? And I'm like, first of all, I don't say there's sides to this. IRB is a partner with us. Think of them as our partners. Think of them you know, they're the facilitators of the federally mandated policies, right? And they're going to do the best they can to help us get approval so we can do our human subjects research in global context. So, but I'm always here on behalf of faculty and students. So if you do have specific questions, feel free to email me and I will get back to you in a timely fashion. But thank you so much for attending. I've given a lot of classes via Zoom now, but it's really different giving a talk because I can't really see all of you at once and see if you're looking confused or if you want to ask a question but you don't want to. But yeah, so thank you. And I look forward to any email questions or follow-up questions that you have. And thanks for the invite. Thanks for the invite, IAS. I appreciate it.